All right, this talk is titled Marital Entropy, but first I want to thank Matt and Jeff for the invitation to Quarry Farm. As I write the book that this is part of, I frequently wrestle with the question of whether the kinds of feminized materials I find myself most interested in, like 19th century histories of women's corsetry and evolutions in marital domestic violence laws, are particularly relevant for the ways that energy humanities scholars think and the things they tend to think about. For good reason, I might add. The ecological and human impacts of pipelines, wind farms, solar panels, shipping ports, AI data centers, further back in time, coal mines, railroads, whale ships, and other charismatic, large-scale energy infrastructures. In my limited time today, I had to narrow down the objects and ideas I was most eager to talk about, and they are not those kinds of things. But I landed on the following pairs. Pair one is the mid-19th century emergence of vulcanized India rubber clothing in an imperial global commodities market, which I'll pair with an 1863 song sheet called The India Rubber Man. Talk more about that in a second. Pair two is the movement to modernize women's corsetry in the same period, particularly as it's discussed in Catherine Beecher's popular 1869 housekeeping manual, The American Woman's Home. I constellate these materials to frame out a marital ecology of extractive violence and speculate about its importance within modernizing mid to late 19th century US energy cultures. My broad premise here, we'll just go back, is that emergent thermodynamic understandings of energy and liberalizing heterosexual marriage regimes share some of the same anxieties and violent proclivities in the period. As scholars like Barri J and Cara New Daggett have shown, the mid-19th century discovery and invention of the science of thermodynamics, and this is, please don't ask me a whole lot about thermodynamics, right? 9 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday. But I feel comfortable that we're mostly like humanities people in here. Thermodynamics is the theory of the relationship between energy and heat and their conversion into one another. And the discovery of this science helps facilitate an imperial global north transition into industrial capitalist energy modernity. But Barri J, Cara New Daggett, go to them for that. My focus in this talk is specifically on the second law of thermodynamics, which is the law of entropy. Entropy is the term for unusable energy in the form of heat generated during every energetic exchange process in a closed system. Translated into the Protestant capitalist idiom of work, entropy represents chaos, and worse, waste. As popular understanding of this second law of thermodynamics took cultural hold, it led to widespread interest in and anxieties about the heat death of the universe and a countervailing productivist impulse to thwart unproductive waste. Euro-American industrial scientific culture did not like the idea of unusable energy. Neither did Euro-American modernizing heterosexual marriage culture. The invention and popularization of thermodynamic energy science in the period correlates in legal marital history with the passage of US Married Women's Property and Earnings Acts. This is all roughly happening in like the 1850s through the 1880s. The gradual erosion of the old legal regime of marital coverture and the first US anti-domestic violence statutes. Those happened after the US Civil War. I'm happy to talk more about that in Q&A if anyone's interested. Curiously, however, these marital reforms preserve a particularly brutal species of marital sexual violence in law. And these laws are called the marital rape exemptions, based on spurious 17th century British common law precedent formulated first by Sir Matthew Hale. And they hold that a husband cannot rape a wife because consensual entry into the marriage contract signals her perpetual, quote, irretractable consent to sex. Translated into the idiom of energy, US law through the 1980s declared it impossible that a wife could ever be sexually unusable to her husband. Gendered sexual violence is something of a fossil, that is, preserved within the modernized, liberalizing 19th century marriage institution. I offer this very condensed summary of thermodynamic and marital legal histories to highlight what I see as an important overlap within the projects of marital and energetic modernity. They share an anxious focus on maximizing productivity and minimizing energetic waste within economic and cultural systems dependent on extractivist conceptions of resources and fuel. The genre of the modern industrial housekeeping manual that Catherine Beecher in large part pioneers conceives of the American housewife as both an energy worker and herself a type of domestic fuel who needs to be respected and husbanded properly in order to do her work of maintaining domestic economy. Beecher's text can, in this way, be read as a riposte to what was coming to be understood at the time of marriage's liberalization as an increasingly outdated, hyper-patriarchal vision of married women being subject to a husband's at times violently enforced authority to conduct the flow of resources, energy, and labor into and out of the home. So Beecher can be read as critiquing that model as a wasteful misuse of the US housewife as an energy actor because it pinions her within outdated marital and energy cultures. The India Rubber Man song sheet helps to clarify this outdated patriarchal marital entropy that Beecher's later American Woman's Home in some ways seeks to renovate. So, originally printed and sold in Winter and Company's music store in Philadelphia, go Birds, the lyrics tell of a husband who disguises himself in a full India rubber gum suit, so involving some species of this kind of clothing, to gag, rob, and assault his wife when she goes out one night, which she frequently does. So the song frames the husband's resolve to spite her as a direct result of her consistent straying outside the confines of their marital home. The proprietary sexual dimensions of the husband's anger at the wife's roving manifest during his disguised attack when he rifles her body with hasty hands while she scratched, she kicked of no avail, her voice too well was stifled. Despite most readers hopefully reacting with discomfort to this species of domestic humor now, the India Rubber Man plays the attack for laughs. The song concludes by reiterating the social benefits of the husband's night as the predatory rubber man. The joke was good to keep at home, all gadding wives, maids, mothers, and daughters, as news of the attack spreads via gossip among other neighborhood women. So the husband's use of violent force resituates the wife as energetic material, a kind of animate fuel to which he alone claims proprietary extractive sexual access in a closed matrimonial system. When we attend to the materiality, the literal material enabling the husband's attack, extractivist violences overlap with marital cultures of gendered sexual violence come into clearer focus. He attacks his wife while dressed in vulcanized rubber gum clothing, widely available for retail purchase by the 1860s. The song sheet is from 1863. And this is more than 20 years after Charles Goodyear's 1839 rediscovery of the chemical vulcanization process for strengthening natural rubber by curing it with sulfur. Versions of the vulcanization process were first developed by Olmec, Maya, Nawa, Mexica, and other Mesoamerican peoples. Centuries before the Iberian conquest, there are classics scholars that do that kind of work. But Goodyear's 1844 US patent for vulcanized rubber goods launches the existing South American rubber trade into the imperial capitalist global commodities market. In 1872, an act of English colonial biopiracy further facilitates the rubber plant's place in imperialist plantation monoculture. The biopirate responsible, this is just a little detour because this guy was too strange, was an Englishman living in Brazil who was destitute by the end of the 1860s, but he is sort of taken in by a group of Confederate soldiers and their wives who have fled the US and they're living in Brazil after the war. His name is Henry Wickham. So they kind of help him get back on his feet. He had for years been trying and uniformly failing to make a living in Brazil by doing things like collecting exotic bird feathers and exporting them back to the UK. This was not lucrative. In 1871, though, Wickham smuggles 70,000 rubber plant seeds back to England. And they make their way to Kew Gardens, and then with the support and funding of the Royal Botanic Society, Kew was where, quote, the personnel, this is Tully, who wrote a great book on the history of rubber called The Devil's Milk. Kew Gardens is where the personnel who provided the research and development for colonial agribusiness were trained. From there, British colonial authorities disseminated 2,500 germinated plants of the rubber tree to various parts of Asia. This colonialist capitalist gambit eventually results in mass clearings of native vegetation in parts of India, Sri Lanka, Singapore, and Malaysia by colonized South Asian laborers to facilitate the growth of large-scale colonial rubber plantation monoculture. So the India rubber man exists within rubber's early imperial extractivist context, in which Victorian industrial and domestic life was already transformed by vulcanized rubber goods in the later decades of the century. These transformations extended to quotidian sexual life, including the availability of rubber condoms for purchase, intriguingly referred to as French preservatives in an 1861 New York Times ad. So wearing modernized, vulcanized rubber fashions, the husband in the song himself becomes something like a violent, mobile French preservative, his prophylactic disguise coating an old patriarchal commonplace with a new thermodynamic twist. Husbands have the right to seize, and in the act of seizing, reiterate the notion of a wife's perpetual consent to be used as a proprietary resource. Putting the song sheet in this context, we see modernizing marital and energic discourses leaching into one another in this early thermodynamic period. The husband, McPhinney, in his India rubber gumsuit, is one iteration of this discursive leaching. Catherine Beecher's American Woman's Home offers another that critiques but ultimately complements. I lost my place. The ideologies undergirding the song sheet. Beecher's thermodynamically informed housekeeping manual is in important ways an attempted recalibration of an energy ethic shared between her work and the India rubber man. They both are focused on minimizing energetic entropic waste within the marital home, with the home's energy being understood as vested in the modern housewife. Beecher's desire to conservatively renovate the modern housewife's sense of herself as an energy worker, deserving of respect, she's very clear on that point, results in a text that consists of punishingly detailed explanations of domestic resource management. She's very interested in ventilation, the importance of proper ventilation, the affordances of burning different types of fuel in the home, always minimizing waste. There's an extensive chapter on sanitary ways of composting human excrement via the earth closet toileting system, which she's a big fan of. I'm not going to talk about that today. In this way, the American Woman's Home aligns with the work of feminist energy historians Abigail Moore and R.W. Sandwell, whose excellent edited collection, In a New Light, Histories of Women and Energy, if you haven't looked at it, details the myriad energy responsibilities women had in their varied 19th century roles, quotes, as servants, wives, and mothers, and I would also add as enslaved workers in the home. I'm also partially in agreement with Alan Ackerman's recent critical reappraisal of Beecher's theory of domestic economy. So Ackerman reads Beecher as proposing a kind of heterodox energy theoretic for the period. In Acker's reading, Beecher thinks about energy in terms of, quote, humility and restraint, physical limits and unacknowledged costs. And she's clear-eyed about domestic infrastructure's reliance on, quote, the exploitation of women and land as resources for unpaid labor, end quote. But I think the humility and restraint Ackerman lauds cannot be so easily separated from the politically and sexually conservative register in which Beecher addresses her women readers. To flesh this out, I'll conclude by considering Catherine Beecher's opinions about ladies' undergarments, and she had them. I'm particularly interested in a section of Beecher's housekeeping manual focused on women's dress reform. Dress reformers' particular ire was targeted at the corset, which had evolved into its most constricting and potentially physiologically damaging form by the second half of the 19th century. This is when the so-called wasp waist look became popular, and you need a lot of infrastructure to make that happen. So this late stage corset, they go out of fashion in the 1920s, right, once the flappers sort of shed their corsets. But this late stage corset was a heavily reinforced garment that frequently contained some or all of the following: thin slices of whalebone or baleen, and that's not unique to the late 19th century. Whalebone had been used in corsets for hundreds of years by this point. But in addition to the whalebone, coarse fabric cording made of buckram or sisal, you can imagine how great that would feel wrapped around you. Wood panels in the front, particularly, metal fasteners in addition to the cloth and lacings. Beecher's critique of corsetry is pithily summed up in her table of contents, where she writes that current fashion attacks the very foundation of the body, the bones. In the corresponding chapter, she offers her women readers a detailed lesson about the mineral composition of their bones as a way of steering them away from excessively restrictive modern corsetry, which she warns leaves women with a sense of, quote, pulling and emptiness at the chest, quote, a feeling of goneness, or an apprehension of their bodies as a falling superstructure. Those are all her quotes. When explaining sacs of synovial fluid that form protective cushions between joints, she compares a woman's body to a machine that provides its own lubrication. Synovial fluid, she writes, quote, answers the same purpose for the joints as oil in making machinery work smoothly. Contradicting her own metaphor of perfect internal calibration, however, Beecher does not recommend that her women readers do away with their corsets. There's no bra burning for Catherine Beecher. Instead, she advocates for a redesigned corset jacket that will, quote, preserve all the advantages of the corset without its evils. To put this in the terms of my argument, what Beecher wants is to renovate the energy worker housewife down to her underwear to make her a more efficient energy actor who can do more work because she can literally breathe a little bit easier. Beecher was not alone. Mass manufacturers of corsets were eager to sell women revolutionary health corsets. Their versions featured mass-produced elastic, but this is not quite the rubberized elastic we think of. Elastic at this period meant coiled metal springs made possible by industrialized steam and coal-powered coiling machines that would make these tiny metal springs. Or corset bones made out of vulcanized rubber or gutta percha. So it's a candy pastel vision of underwear that lets housewives do more work with less waste of their finite energy. And you see in this ad, right, like the little girl through the nursing mother, right? Everyone gets to join the revolution of like the metal spring corsets. So elasticized corsets are categorically not the same thing as sexually violent rubber man husbands, but both share an investment in warding off the chaotic specter of a wife's unusable energy, a wife going to waste. So although elastic corsets and rubber men aren't isomorphic, using the literary historical method energy humanities scholar Jamie Jones calls, quote, energy archaeology, I hope to have positioned marital sexual cultures, liberalizing marital laws that preserve the husband's right to rape at their core, and emergent thermodynamic energy cultures as discursive interlocutors. While I'm not claiming a causative relationship, I'm arguing that the compromised position of wives in this period of marital reform is a key part of what makes the new scientific theory of entropy compelling and frustrating in a productivist Euro-American energy imaginary. Preserved marital rape exemptions declared that it was still possible for a husband to maintain perpetual access to a wife's sexual energies by declaring the violation of rape to be non-existent within marriage. This grotesque legal imaginary facilitates an imagination of broader social worlds in which there's no such thing, ultimately, as energy unusable to patriarchy. Considered in this light, the liberalization of heterosexual marriage laws and norms may also help explain, and here I'm just speculating, more contemporary attachments to the notion of things like a clean energy transition. As so much energy humanities work makes clear, there are no definitive energy transitions that make clean breaks with our oil-soaked past or other modes of energy before that. Damage and consequences are at this point baked in. And energy culture, like any aspect of human culture, is a heterochronous social assemblage of new and old practices and beliefs that, in Elizabeth Carolyn Miller's words, quote, emerge through narrative and discourse, through a complex negotiation of reality, abstraction, and fantasy, end quote. A US heterosexual marital culture that modernizes while preserving the right to enact gendered sexual violence at its core is a key ideological component that facilitates cultural acceptance of other such energic fantasies. No such thing as unusable energy. Elastic health corsets, with their coiled metal or rubberized bones, may feel marginally better on the eternally busy 19th century housewife's body, better at least than being gagged and attacked by her husband in an India rubber gum suit. But that is a mere exchange of materials, not a transition. Wives have long known this. Thank you.